This is the complete audiobook of Melting Into Stillness, read by the author, Terry Oldfield. Introduction. For most of my life, I believed I was a musician. That was the story, and for a long time it felt like a good one. It gave shape to things. It gave direction. It carried me into places I could never have imagined as a boy sitting beside a river with a fishing rod. Music came early. It felt natural, sometimes effortless, sometimes mysterious. Sound became a kind of language for me, a way of touching something that words seemed unable to reach. Over the years, music gave me a life, concerts, recordings, collaborations, and moments of real beauty. And yet somewhere along the way, something quieter began to stir. It didn't announce itself. It was not a revelation. It was more like a subtle question that refused to disappear. A sense that what I was really drawn to in music was not only the notes themselves, but the space they arose from and returned to. At first I assumed this was simply a deepening of musicianship, a refinement of sensitivity. But gradually it became clear that something else was unfolding. The listening was shifting. It was no longer only outward toward sound. It was turning inward toward the silence in which sound appears. There seemed to be a stillness that did not begin when the music began and did not end when it faded. A presence that was there before the first note and remained after the last. I would not have called it awareness at the time. I didn't have a language for it. I only knew that something more intimate than music itself was quietly revealing itself through the music. So this book is not a philosophy. It's simply a reflection on how a life in sound gradually opened into something deeper and more ordinary than I could ever have imagined. Music may have been the path, but silence, it seems, was always the greater teacher. So what follows is not a story of attainment. If anything, it's a story of something falling away, the image of a musician, the sense of being the doer, the idea of being someone moving towards something. What remains is simpler than any story. So if there's anything to take from these pages, maybe it's this. What you are listening for has always been here. Chapter 1. The Music That Made Me. Music was here long before I thought I was. I don't remember deciding to become a musician. There was no moment of declaring that this would be my life. Music was there prior to any decision, long before I thought about any direction. Some of my earliest memories of that quiet pull came not from the flute, but from water. As a boy, I would spend most of my spare time fishing beside rivers and streams, and sometimes by still lakes, where very little seemed to move. I remember the sound of the current clearly, the way it folded over the stones, the light trembling on the surface. I didn't think of this as listening, it was simply being there. The usual sense of being someone doing something would ease into the background. There was just water moving, the quiet weight of the rod in my hands. Only later did I realize how much those hours shaped me. At the time there were no ideas about it, just attention without effort. When music entered my life more formally, it felt familiar in a way I could not explain. A note would rise and fall like a ripple. Silence would gather again, just as the surface of the water settles back into stillness. When I began working more seriously with the flute, I assumed that any improvement would feel like success. But the best moments didn't feel like success at all. They felt quieter than that. Something would open, and I would forget myself for a while. As the years passed, music became more than fascination. It became work. It became something I called myself. I learned to introduce myself in certain ways. I'm a musician. I'm a composer. Those words carried weight. They opened doors. They created expectations. And I stepped into that role willingly. There was real joy in the craft, the long hours shaping sound, the strange intimacy of playing, where something formed in a quiet room could travel out and meet people I would never know. Yet even then, something in the background remained unchanged. A quiet sense that music didn't quite belong to me in the way I sometimes claimed it did. More like I was part of the current than directing it. I didn't think of this as spiritual. It was simply how it felt. Only much later did I begin to wonder about the space from which music arises. What is here before the first note? What remains after the last one fades? At the time, those questions were not clearly formed. They were more like a subtle stirring. Something felt rather than understood. Looking back, I can see that music was doing something more than building a life. It was gently loosening my certainty about who that life belonged to. And perhaps that loosening had already begun years earlier, beside the river, long before I ever thought of myself as a musician. Chapter 2. The Quiet Before. Listening began long before I knew what listening was. Before I ever thought of myself as a musician, I was drawn to sound. I noticed that it affected me. A door closing, the change in tone when someone was upset, the way a house felt different when it was quiet. As a child, I was sensitive to atmosphere. The mood of a room could change everything. Silence could feel comforting or heavy. A single sound could shift the whole space. I didn't think this was unusual. It was simply how life appeared to me. Looking back, I can see that something was already taking shape there, though I would not have had words for it at the time. There was a kind of attentiveness that wasn't forced. I wasn't trying to listen. I just found myself noticing. So when I first held the flute, it felt strangely familiar. Not in the sense of having done it before, but in the sense that it belonged to the same world as those early hours by the river. Breath moving through something, vibration meeting space. The fact that sound could arise from breath, something invisible becoming audible, felt quietly miraculous. The moment before a note, the moment it faded. Those moments felt alive in their own way. I wouldn't have spoken of awareness or presence. I only sensed that something was there. It was many years before I realized that this sensitivity to sound was also a sensitivity to what surrounds it, to something that cannot quite be named. At the time, it was just ordinary life. Now I can see that what I thought was simply an interest in music was already something wider. I was listening before I knew what I was listening for. Chapter 3. Becoming a musician. What had begun as a natural sensitivity to sound slowly became more serious. Instruments were no longer just something to explore. They became something to practice, to return to every day. There were scales, exercises, moments of frustration, and small breakthroughs that felt like victories. I began to understand that making music wasn't only about feeling. It required repetition, patience, a willingness to sound bad for quite a long time before sounding even remotely good. There was satisfaction in seeing something improve through effort, noticing that the fingers moved more easily than they had a year before. Gradually, without my really noticing it, music became more than something I loved. It became what I did. And then somewhere along the way, it became who I was. I'm a musician. It was a simple sentence, but it carried weight. It gave direction. It made sense of the hours spent alone practicing, while others were doing more ordinary things. There was pride in that. There was also pressure to improve, to succeed, to justify. As opportunities appeared, performances, recordings, travel, the role grew more solid. Other people began to see me as a musician, and that seemed to confirm it. I didn't question any of this. It felt natural. Without realizing it, something had shifted. Music was no longer just sound moving through me. It was tied to how I felt about myself. A good performance lifted me. A poor one lingered longer than it should have. Praise felt personal. Criticism felt personal. I was no longer simply playing. I was protecting something. I would not have described it that way. I simply felt the ups and downs that come with caring deeply about what you do. Only later did I begin to see how the sense of me was quietly strengthening. The one who practices, the one who succeeds or fails. It didn't feel like ego, it felt more like responsibility. If the music worked, I'd done something right. If it didn't, I'd done something wrong. The role became real, the story more solid. And music, which had once simply been sound and silence, now carried expectation. Only later did I begin to wonder whether the one I thought I was making the music was as fixed as I believed. But at this stage I was simply becoming what I thought I wanted to be, a musician. Chapter 4. Success and Discontent. The music was reaching people, albums were being made, there was movement, momentum, a sense that something real was taking shape. This is what success looks like in a musician's life. Not always dramatic, often gradual. A steady layering of work, reputation and experience. A sense that you've found your place. And in many ways I had. There was genuine satisfaction in seeing the music travel. Something born quietly in a room could move outward and touch people I would never meet. That always felt mysterious to me. But alongside all of that, there was something harder to name. Not unhappiness, just a faint, persistent restlessness. On the surface, nothing was wrong. The career was functioning, the identity of musician felt established. The story made sense. And yet there were moments, usually in the spaces between busyness, when a question would surface quietly. Is this enough? It wasn't a dramatic question, more a subtle gap, a sense that the outer story didn't quite touch, something deeper that I could feel but not define. I didn't interpret this spiritually at the time. I simply noticed that achievement didn't settle whatever that question was. Music still mattered, but it no longer answered everything. It felt as though I was asking it to carry something it wasn't meant to carry. And yet, I didn't know what that something was. Chapter 5. Music becomes a mirror. At first, music had been expression. Later it became vocation. Then gradually something shifted. There were moments, usually unplanned, that felt different. The sense of me doing something would fade. The music seemed less constructed and more allowed. There was listening, but no effort. More like being absorbed. In those moments, the notes didn't feel like the centre of it. Something quieter seemed to hold it all together. When I tried to recreate it, it disappeared. When I relaxed, it returned. I didn't have language for this. I wouldn't have spoken about presence or awareness. I only knew that the music felt more alive when I wasn't holding on to it. That unsettled me. So much of my life had been built on effort, practice, control, achievement. And yet here was something that seemed to deepen when I softened. It made me wonder, quietly, what happened when I stopped trying so hard. Perhaps the music didn't need so much from me. I didn't understand it, but I began to notice it. And that noticing began to change something. Chapter 6. The Flow of Creation. For a long time, I thought creativity was something I did. You sit down, you have an idea, you work at it, you shape it into something finished. That was how I understood it. And of course, practice mattered. Discipline mattered. I spent years refining technique, learning how to make the flute respond, how to shape tone, how to sustain attention. But somewhere along the way, I began to notice something I couldn't quite explain. The pieces that felt most alive didn't seem to come from effort. They came when I stopped trying quite so hard. There were times I would sit with the flute with no clear intention, no strong idea of what I was about to play, and something would just begin, just a phrase, then another. The more I relaxed, the more it would flow. I simply began to trust that not knowing was sometimes more useful than knowing. It felt less like I was inventing something and more like I was just letting it happen. And that was new to me. It felt as though the music breathed when I wasn't steering it. And I noticed the same thing in conversation. The most honest exchanges happened when I wasn't rehearsing what to say. In writing, the clearest sentences came when I wasn't forcing them. Life at times seemed to move more easily when I just stepped aside. I didn't fully understand that, and I still don't in a way. But I began to see that what I called my creativity wasn't really personal. And that shift, barely noticeable at first, has stayed with me. Chapter 7. Silence as a Teacher. As my relationship with music changed, my relationship with silence changed with it. At first, silence was simply the space between notes. A necessary pause, nothing more. But over time it began to feel less like absence and more like something quietly present. There were moments, often when nothing special was happening, when I would notice a kind of stillness beneath everything. It was easy to overlook. When attention rested there, something in me softened. Time felt less urgent. The sense of having somewhere to get to relaxed slightly. I didn't set out to find this. In fact, it seemed most noticeable when I wasn't trying to achieve anything at all. Gradually, I began to sense that silence was not something I stepped into. It didn't come and go in the way sound did. When sound stopped, something remained. When thought quietened, something remained. And when I stopped reaching for the next thing, something remained. I couldn't describe it very well. It wasn't an object, it wasn't a particular experience. It was simply there. This didn't seem like an insight. It unfolded slowly, through playing, through waiting, through not knowing what to do next. Looking back, I can see that silence was quietly shaping everything that followed. Not by giving answers, but by showing that not everything needed one. Chapter 8. Grace. For a long time I assumed that understanding was something I would achieve. So if I practiced enough, reflected enough, surely something would eventually shift. It seemed obvious that clarity had to be earned. And yet the moments that mattered most didn't arrive because I forced them. They seemed to appear when something relaxed, when I stopped trying quite so hard. When the need to become someone who understood eased. When clarity came, it didn't feel like achievement. It felt more like noticing something simple that had been there all along. The word grace feels close, though I use it carefully. Not something mystical, more as the natural ease that appears when effort softens. At times it felt less like moving towards something, more like stepping slightly aside. But nothing dramatic changed. Action continued. Reflection continued. But the urgency thinned. There was less pressure to arrive. And in that easing, understanding sometimes surfaced on its own, quietly, without fanfare. And just as quietly it would fade again. And life carried on. Chapter 9. The Illusion of the Doer. Action happens, but the one who claims it is harder to find. For most of my life, I assumed I was the one doing everything. It seemed obvious. I practiced, I chose, I acted. Things happened because I made them happen. But when I started to look more carefully, especially while playing music, I began to notice something a little strange. A phrase would appear before I had consciously put it together. Breath would move, fingers would follow. And only afterwards would the thought come, I did that. The movement came first, the claim came after. I began to notice the same thing in everyday life. Words would come before they were fully planned. Decisions didn't always feel constructed. More like they surfaced on their own. This didn't mean I disappeared or that responsibility vanished. Life went on as it always had. But the sense of being the one in control, the one managing everything, started to feel less convincing. When I tried to find the one who was supposedly doing it all, I could find thoughts, impulses, intentions, but not a clear centre behind them. At first that was unsettling. But alongside that, there was also a kind of quiet relief. The pressure to control every outcome began to ease. Music flowed more freely when I wasn't holding it so tightly. And in that easing, life began to feel a little lighter. Chapter 10. Neti, Neti. Not this, not that. As these changes continued, I began to notice something else. Just when things seemed to open up, the mind would quietly build something new. I understand now. This is it. I've found it. These thoughts felt convincing. And for a while, I would rest there, until something came along to unsettle it all again. I came across the phrase, Neti, Neti. Not this, not that. I didn't take it on as a belief. It simply felt like a gentle reminder. And when I looked at the body, I could see it was always changing. When I watched thoughts, they came and went. Emotions rose, lingered, and passed. Everything I could point to seemed to move. None of that left me with a final answer. If anything, it left me quieter, perhaps. So instead of finding somewhere firm to stand, there was much less certainty. Not this, not that. No method. It was more a reluctance to cling too tightly to anything. And as things quietened, I also began to notice how easily one explanation just replaces another. Old beliefs fall away and new ones step in. And these are often dressed in a spiritual language. Teachings can be helpful and concepts can grab attention. But when they become something to hold on to, they just become another part of the story, and that needs protecting. What began to feel more honest was something much simpler. Staying with what was actually happening. Breath is happening, sound, thought is happening. And none of it requires a belief. I was less interested in having the right explanation because life doesn't fit into a system. There was a kind of relaxation in that. But what remained was not a certainty. It was openness. Chapter 11. Life without a centre. At a certain point, something very simple began to feel obvious. There were times when it seemed that music didn't really need me in the way I'd once assumed. That might sound strange after a lifetime of playing and composing. But in direct experience, the music had never felt like mine. It appeared, unfolded and faded, whether I claimed it or not. The hands still move, the breath still flows, the ear still listens. But the sense of being the one doing it all is less defined. The more I stopped trying, the more alive it felt. This didn't mean abandoning the craft. The years of practice are still there. But something softened in the doing. As a boy, sound fascinated me. But I never felt that I owned it. Somewhere along the way, that simplicity became layered with ambition and expectation. Over time, it's all begun to feel simple again. So when I sit with the flute now, there's less of what should I play, more of a quiet listening. Sometimes that becomes sound, sometimes it doesn't. There's difficulty, grief, and aging. Life moves as it does. It just feels ordinary. Laughter, tenderness, life continues. Decisions are made, plans unfold, conversations happen. Relationships feel lighter, no less intimate, if anything, more so. And listening happens much more easily. Not because of effort, but because there's less in the way. And within all that, simple things stand out. Making tea, walking, playing the flute, just sitting quietly. The kettle sings, nothing special, just part of what's here. There's no effort to reach anywhere. Sometimes music comes, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's only quietness. And I find myself, once again, simply sitting by the water.